I thought it'd be an interesting place to start with proven conspiracies, because I want to acknowledge on one hand that there are such thing as real conspiracies, and I think the existence of some of these helps fuels the paranoia in people's minds of being like, well, that was true, so this can be true too. So I want to go over some of the more notable ones and get your take on it. And maybe you can clarify, but like, for example, MKUltra, I'm sure you're aware of. The CIA was testing LSD on unknown participants to see if they could make Soviet spies defect against their will, or if the Soviets could do that to CIA agents who were captured. That was the goal.
Yeah.
And the CIA was administering LSD to people without their consent or knowledge to study the effect. They even at times set up fake brothels and lured men in from the general public and then dosed them with LSD and experimented on them. The reason it being a brothel is because they figured they'd be too embarrassed to talk about it afterwards. In one case, they administered LSD to a mental patient in Kentucky for 174 days. Several people died as a result of MKUltra, most notably Frank Olson, a CIA employee, one of their own, who was covertly dosed with LSD, held for study, and then 6 days later committed suicide when somebody wasn't properly supervising him. He jumped out the window. So this is the kind of thing that you look and you say, oh, God, the government's capable of that. Then, of course, they're capable of, chemtrails.
Yeah, I think you got to look at the actual scale of things and also look at the historical context. I mean, this was back in, what was it, the 60s?
Yes.
That it happened. And, it's the height of Cold War.
Right.
There's lots of fears about things. There were other things as well similar to that, like they tested the dispersion of biological weapons and chemical weapons by spraying them in places. But when they did it, they weren't doing it with the intent of harming people or trying to actually infect people. They were just trying to see in a safe way what the effects would be. Now, that what you're talking about there sounds pretty bad, like especially, using mental patients. I don't know exactly how accurate that is, but the story about Frank Olson, that's true. And there's some suspicion that he was actually thrown out of the window rather than jumped, because he was becoming very erratic after he was involved in this study. And he kind of knew afterwards what had happened, but he was acting very strangely, and they thought he was going to blow the whole cover or talk to the Russians about it or something like that. And so there's some suspicion that he might actually have been thrown out the window, which is a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, that's a conspiracy theory in
within
itself.
the conspiracy.
So when you hear something like that, do you think it's credible when you hear like, oh, well, I mean, in the scope of what it was, sure, why wouldn't it be credible?
Well, you got to think
these were criminals.
Yeah, but the chemtrails conspiracy theory is on such a completely different scale. The idea that all the planes that we see in the sky for the last 70 plus years, well, no, say since the 70s, say, have been spraying us with some kind of chemical, and no one's ever come forward to say that,
or simply
no one's figured it out.
Yeah,
and all the evidence that people give for this thing is completely ridiculous. Like the fact that the CIA did bad things in the 60s and 70s, everybody knows that. The CIA was like almost like a rogue organization, and they did a lot of bad things. They did false flag operations in foreign countries. So yes, we know they did these things, but compare like with like. Don't just say like they dosed some people. That means they're dosing people now. They did some controlled experiments that were like very limited in scope on a small number of people, most of whom were actually volunteers. And then they did some stuff that was very immoral and didn't pass the clinical test standards. But it's a completely different thing from everybody in the United States is being sprayed with something poisonous.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, obviously, that was a small-scale thing. Did the CIA come forward with that information, or was that something that was unveiled through investigative work?
The MKUltra, they had House hearings on it that kind of forced them to release the information. I think there's just been a big info dump of documents being released, FOIA documents, on a site called the Black Vault. The guy just got like thousands of pages of documents today. Like all the stuff on MKUltra. I just saw a tweet this morning. So it's going to be interesting. To see if anything new comes out.
Right. But I wanted to follow up just to kind of show like kind of what the government is capable of doing in a case like this. After he committed suicide or was murdered, possibly, the U.S. government first described it as a suicide, then as a misadventure. So they're removing the blame from themselves in effect, and nobody really knows. Another one that was just absolutely insane, I think you alluded to, was radiation testing on the U.S. public during the Cold War.
Yeah.
Which is like, for example, in San Francisco, they would pepper in radioactive activity into the rolling fog.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was actually radioactive, though. There's a thing called zinc cadmium sulfate.
Yes.
Is the thing they use, which isn't really radioactive. It's fluorescent, which means, if you shine an infrared light on it, an ultraviolet light on it, it will glow. So it's a thing that you can track very easily. And the reason they used it wasn't to see how well radioactive stuff spread. It was to see how well powder spread. Because they figured, the Russians or whoever would be spraying stuff into the air. How much of San Francisco or whatever would it actually get through? And to do that, they needed something that they could detect very easily. So they used this ZCS, zinc cadmium sulfate, which they thought was perfectly safe at the time. It's not like some strange radioactive stuff. It's just stuff that glows in the dark when you shine a light on it. So they could detect it very easily. I don't know whether you had like a little detector of glowing specks or something, but that's why they used that.
I see. So they thought it was safe, but it wasn't. Because I had read that there was cases of known cancer as a result.
No, the thing about, people say there were cases of cancer from things. You can always find some kind of correlation between any one thing and cancer. Like if you live near power lines, people will say you can find a correlation between living near power lines. There's always going to be like hotspots here and there. There's always going to be some people who attribute their cancer to something. There's no real proven correlation between this release of zinc cadmium sulfate and that. And it's something it's pretty safe. I mean, you wouldn't want to be eating teaspoons of it, but a little bit of it sprayed in the air probably wasn't going to hurt anybody. I think they likened it to like the effects of 1 secondhand smoke, like being in a room with somebody whilst they smoked a cigarette, or like less than that, like a fraction of that.
Here's a big one that we all take for granted, the NSA surveillance. The scope of that before it was leaked was something that none of us could have ever imagined what was taking place. So I think the existence of that is probably fuel to the fire of a lot of conspiracy theorists that the U.S. government is spying on citizens of pretty much of all level of detail. In fact, this is one of my favorite anecdotes that Snowden revealed. He says, in the course of their daily work, they stumbled across something that was completely unrelated to the work. For example, an intimate nude photo of someone in a sexually compromising situation, but they're extremely attractive. He said, what do? They turn around in their chair and show it to their coworker, and their coworker would say, hey, that's great, send it to Bill down the way. They considered it perks of their job.
Yeah, that's terrible as well. It's the NSA, the government spying on American citizens, like they do as much as they can get away with.
Sure.
They want to have as much information as they can. They're constrained by the law, but they're also constrained by how much the law is enforced. Like they're supposed to get FISA warrants for people, but they can have sealed warrants. A lot of the stuff that was revealed was stuff like the metadata for phone calls. Like they would record every single phone call you made, not necessarily record the actual voice, but they do have the capability of recording all the voice and looking at it later, which is something that they're arguing that they can use that to get around the laws against recording, because if no one listens to it, it's just a temporary buffer essentially. Then so I wouldn't trust the NSA.
Oh, yeah.
I don't trust the government. I mean, I don't think people should trust the government.
Interesting.
And I think that, when you hear about things like that and the Snowden's revelations, that's something that we need to, look at, and we need to have checks and balances in place, and we need to actually work to try to stop things like that happening.
So where does a healthy distrust of the government end and an unhealthy distrust of the government begin?
Well, it's when you start believing things that really aren't backed up by the evidence, when it's just kind of a suspicion of something, and the thing you're suspicious of is something that is very outlandish and would require a very, very large operation. Like, for example, the buildings that collapsed on 9/11. Some people say that they were rigged with explosives so that they would collapse from explosives after the planes had hit them. Now, that isn't backed up really by any evidence at all. People say there's evidence, but when you look at the evidence they present, it's really, really bad, terrible evidence. And the theory itself doesn't really make any sense. You had planes fly into the buildings, big hole in them, huge fires that went on for hours, and then the buildings collapsed from the fire, and everybody in the engineering community, they collapsed because of the fire.
Mm-hmm.
So now you got these other people coming along, and they're saying, "Oh no, it was explosives." And it must have been explosives because it looked really weird, like the collapse looked really weird. But there isn't really any strong evidence for it. So you're coming up with a distrust of the government, but it's a ridiculous thing. And it's fair enough saying the government does evil things, or people in the government do evil things. And the government is lying to the people a lot of the time. Most of the stuff you're seeing coming out of the White House is PR, essentially. It isn't really just them trying to let you know stuff. And that's good. You should actually have that distrust of the government. But it doesn't mean that every anti-government theory is automatically true. You have to actually look at, is this theory actually a viable theory?
Right. There's one more. This one, I think a lot of people hold this to be true. I certainly did, but when I started looking into it, it seems that reports of it are very contested, that the CIA was trafficking crack and cocaine in the 80s to help fund some of their campaigns, and they were largely responsible for the crack epidemic in black neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's kind of a multi-layered one, really. Like the people... they said they were selling drugs for guns, or drugs for whatever they were doing to finance their operations. Which I don't know. I'm not sure if that's true.
Well,
there's evidence.
Apparently, in 1986, a spokesman acknowledged that funds from sales of cocaine smuggled into the U.S. had helped fund the Contra rebels, but said that smuggling was not authorized by the U.S. government or resistance leaders.
Right. Yeah, I'm not really familiar with that one, so I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
But then there's the broader conspiracy there that they deliberately sold crack in black neighborhoods to, keep
impoverish them. Yeah.
Yeah, just keep black people poor, essentially, which is, obviously a pretty serious,
pretty
conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any real evidence behind that. They would sell it in neighborhoods where crack had been sold before, I would imagine.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
I don't know if they had any kind of conscious pushing it into certain neighborhoods.
Well, let me ask you this. Are there any proven, confirmed conspiracy theories that are favorites of yours that come to mind?
Well, there's very obvious conspiracy theories that are true, conspiracies that were true, like Richard Nixon lying about Watergate.
Right.
We all know what happened now. In great detail, we know exactly what happened.
Right.
But at the time, he was denying it, and half the country thought that he wasn't lying. If they did surveys at the time, do you trust Nixon on the Watergate issue? And they believed him, and that turned out to be the conspiracy there was true. But I think there's a huge range of conspiracies that happen all the time. We live in a country, we're in a world where there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of corruption, and there's a lot of graft. There's a lot of you pat my back, I'll pat yours. I'll do something for you, you do something for me, favors. People conspire to do things. And the one I always come back to is just simply politicians doing things for industry, essentially the military-industrial complex. That we have the government makes regulations, industry doesn't like regulations or will prefer certain regulations, so industry lobbies the government to try to get the regulations a certain way. They don't just lobby, though. They give campaign contributions to politicians. They give gifts to politicians. And at some point, it kind of steps over the line from giving these gifts to actual, essentially, bribery. And people are being convicted for this. It's not really, a conspiracy theory that it happens. We don't know exactly who's doing it until they get caught. But we know that this is actually happening. We know that industry is essentially buying Congress to make favorable regulations for them. And that's the type of very serious conspiracy that I think that people would be much better off focusing on.
I mean,
That's
right?
true.
Yeah. I mean, the consequence of that is as big as anything else that people are paranoid
yeah.
about. You know.
Yeah, and another of my favorites along those lines is the prison industrial complex. Prisons, for-profit prisons, they're trying to make money.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
And
insane.
so they will lobby the government for regulations and laws that will make them more money, which means they do things like trying to increase mandatory minimum sentences. And so they're essentially bribing politicians to like boost the laws, boost the sentencing laws, so people will have to spend more time in jail for essentially harmless offenses. A lot of them are just like
Weed
drug
smoking.
offenses. Yeah, weed.
Nonviolent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The fact
That's
that-
another great one, I think.
Yeah, the fact that prison is related with profit just seems so
terrible.
Well,
wrong.
there's more prisoners in the United States than any other country, including China with billions of people. Or the stat is like
Yeah, per capita,
Per-
I think. Yeah.
1% of the U.S. population is in prison. Is that right? Or
Yes.
about?
Yes, it is. About,
I mean, that's
so it's
staggering.
3 million people
That is absolutely
in
staggering.
prison. And it's just this kind of constant thing. And it really, it took off with the war on drugs. So a lot of these people are just essentially drug offenders. But then they don't really have a very good support system. So you get them going to jail and they're coming out, and then they get some other petty offense, and now they're in the 3 strikes system. So they
Right.
go back for another 20 years or something. So.
Meanwhile, the opioids are being prescribed to everyone, so
Right.
the real war
Yeah.
on drugs
I mean,
is
that's
like
another
not
conspiracy,
even
right? By pharmaceutical companies to get people addicted to drugs.
Yeah. Is it a conspiracy theory?
It's not really a
It's,
conspiracy theory. It's just a fact.
They're trying to sell their drugs, and they want people to get them. So
It's up to the government, right, to regulate them, and it's them to sell as much drugs as possible.
if you see a commercial on TV, that essentially is this drug company trying to persuade you that you need their drug.
right.
So many drug commercials too, isn't
Yeah.
it just terrifying?
Yeah, and it
It
really should
is.
be just, your doctor should tell you if you
Yeah.
actually need it. It's not you saying,
And
hey,
they're-
doctor, I got to have this drug.
They go
Yeah.
talk to your doctor about this new drug.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
is the doctor, I mean, how corrupt is the doctor profession where you can come to them and say, I saw this commercial and I want to try this drug. And the doctor is more persuaded by that than what you may actually need.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a messed up system. And I think in other countries, they don't allow
not.
adverts like that
I
on
mean,
TV.
coming from Israel, I remember being really shocked when I saw the commercial break and how much of it was for drugs.
Daytime telly, it's like 50%.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Israel, I think all you would see is kind of like Advil, something for headache,
Over the counter.
over the counter kind
Yeah.
of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great point you bring up. I think it's something that a lot of people should bear in mind is like, you can spend all day thinking about chemtrails and anti-vax and 9/11, but ultimately you have 1% of the population in prison. You've got incredible amounts of corruption in our government, and that's more harmful than even if their conspiracies were true. I feel like that's inflicting more harm on the populace.
Yeah, to a large degree, yeah. I mean, if you think about 9/11, sure. If 9/11 was true that it was a conspiracy by the U.S. government, obviously that would be a huge, terrible thing. But it's not actually affecting that many people right now. It's
Yeah.
something that happened for and was used for propaganda purposes. I think it was just as it appears to be, and it's not an actual conspiracy by the government. But if it was, why? How is your activism in 9/11 going to help?
Yeah,
Right.
Help the world make
it
a
won't.
better place?
It won't really.